Hello. Today we are going to discuss what it takes for foreign entrepreneurs to be successful in Silicon Valley. However, we are going to start the presentation with a perspective of the history of Silicon Valley. And I would like to go right into the beginning. If we move to 1840, which is about the time that everything started here, the population of the Bay Area, Northern California, it was probably not bigger than few hundred families. At that time, this place was completely isolated from the rest of the world. There were no telegraph or railway connecting to the East Coast, and the only way to really come here, other than crossing the entire continental United States, was through boats or ships that they were communicating with other ports. In 1848 was the time that the news of the gold rush arrived to the rest of the world. And in fact, it did arrive first to the port of Valparaiso in Chile, or some ports in Asia, before that arrived to New York, and even later actually arrived into Europe. And this was the time that people came into this part of the world, and the main objective was the attraction or to find gold. So let's look for a second, who were these gold rush entrepreneurs? These were the people that they were willing to take an enormous amount of risk. And at that time, you pay the risk, you pay the highest price, because the price was your own life. And some of these risk takers are individuals that Levi Strauss, which is somebody that we know because we all use or wear his products. In fact, it was the creation of a mining cluster, and within the creation of that mining cluster, it was Levi Strauss producing the cloth that the miners use. By the way, this cluster mining was created by necessity, not because they knew the theory of cluster formation by Professor Michael Porter, but it was just out of geographic isolation that they needed to create the shovels and the picks. They need to establish their own banking infrastructure, like we have here, Mr. Wells and Mr. Fargo, and labor. It was manual labor assisted by this primitive tool that enabled the early gold rush entrepreneurs to find their fortune. At the same time, the ecosystem was dominated by nature. It was nature of this incredible place with incredible beauty that it was the ecosystem where they participated. And as I said, it was a place that was dangerous because mining, not only just because mining is a dangerous activity, but this was a wild place. It was isolated, there were bears that they could attack, there were the possibility to have accidents in the mines, and therefore the self-selection process, the DNA of these individuals were willing to take an incredible amount of risk. Let's step back and reflect between these immigrants of the 1840s, 1850s, and let's compare and contrast with the same immigrant that arrived, the same wave of immigration that arrived into the American Northeast 200 years later. Those immigrants were dominated in the 1600s by the desire to express freely their religious or political beliefs. Very different, the immigrants that are right here 200 years later were really driven by this economic success. The preparation required, it was, first of all, they have to, the self-selection of the DNA that we have discussed before, but also the willingness to take a journey that often was a one-way ticket into a place that they have an incredible beauty, as they discovered, and hence they decided to settle permanently here. And then to embrace very primitive tools and the aids of animals, that was the only way to leverage themselves in their economic activities. The reward was really one, and it was the ability to find gold, and it was this economic reward that actually dominated as they came here. However, in their sense of isolation, they have to form communities, and these communities were dominated by the first settlements that the immigrants did, as well as the formation of schools, churches, and very quickly the wealth was also funneled into the creation of universities that started dominating the landscape of what we know today as Northern California, the Bay Area, or Silicon Valley. After the decay of the gold during the gold rush time, this was followed by an agribusiness and real estate. This was moderately successful in Santa Clara Valley, but it was not really, it was a mismatch with the identity of this place and the wealth that the early entrepreneurs were seeking. And this was, of course, now leveraged by the Industrial Revolution type of equipment, and the valley was constantly seeking to renew itself. And this renewal came in different waves that we're going to see very quickly. It continued with a desire to communicate with wireless communication. By now the innovation of Marconi have arrived into the West Coast, and therefore the use of vacuum tubes as a way to be used in wireless communication became a reality. This followed with test equipment and the quintessential firm of Silicon Valley, which is Hewlett-Packard, and the first electronic instrument that they created in the 30s and 40s. And this was continued by microwaves, which bring us just after the Second World War. After the Second World War, it marked very clearly a new period of Silicon Valley, because the arrival of defense contracts, and these defense contracts were motivated by two elements. A, just to give California its fair share of government contracts, because by now it has grown in size and importance, but also because the success during the Second World War of the developing of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. The fact that the government decided to develop in New Mexico, it was in part because to avoid the spy network that was concentrated in the eastern corridor between Boston and Washington, D.C. And therefore, by pushing the defense contract farther west, they were avoiding that type of element. So, because of those two elements, now a number of defense contracts start arriving into California, in particular Northern California, and that was an essential element of kicking in modern Silicon Valley until, and the next wave was given by the development of the integrated circuit, by the premier firms, initially by Shockley Laboratories, immediately followed by Fairchild Semiconductors, as well as Intel. The wave of the integrated circuit, it defined what it is today, Silicon Valley. And in fact, silicon derives its name from semiconductor, being silicon, which by the way is sun, purified sun, which is the key element to produce the chips, the semiconductor material. The aggregation of multiple chips led to a new type of device, which is the personal computer, and this personal computer now was connected in a number of networks, and it continued. Now, these waves of innovation have led in what I call the birth of Silicon Valley, and let's review in the same way that we did for the gold rush entrepreneurs. Let's review now for the silicon entrepreneurs, the semiconductor entrepreneurs, what were the stakeholders elements. First of all, who were the risk takers? We have to recognize two gentlemen in terms of being the founding fathers of Silicon Valley. The first one is Fred Terman. Fred was a professor, eventually department head of the electrical engineering, later dean, and eventually provost of all of those positions at Stanford University. And he is being recognized because he brought to Stanford something totally revolutionary. He said to the Stanford professors, as a way for them to get promoted, that they shouldn't just do publications and papers, but the key elements in terms of their success and their career growth will be based on their ability to bring the technology outside the classroom, outside the labs, into the formation of new companies. And by the way, he invited them to do it with their own students. And he role modeled that because students from Fred Terman had been going out and forming companies like Little Industry, Hewlett-Packard, and Varian, and he was a member of the board of directors of those companies. So he had encouraged to become involved in these new ventures with the students and to share the financial success of those companies. This was totally revolutionary at that time. And not only he went that far, but he went even further by supporting those ventures, since Stanford University was a very large land owner, land that they couldn't sell. He was providing low-cost, long-term lease to these companies in terms, and therefore this led to the formation of an industrial park or a scientific park around Stanford University. And therefore he is recognized as one of the founding fathers. The other founding father is Bill Shockley. Bill Shockley had been recognized as the Nobel Prize winner because he participated of the invention of the transistor. The transistor is the minimum expression of what we know as an integrated circuit or a semiconductor. And in fact, he did that work in the East Coast. He was part of the famous Bell Labs at the time, where the transistor was discovered. But actually, in 56, early 57, he received funding for a number of wealthy individuals in the East Coast to move to the West Coast and to settle Shockley Laboratories, semiconductor laboratory. And the story goes that this laboratory was initially planned to be set in Los Angeles, but actually a malfunctioning of the plane landed in San Francisco, and he was captured by the beauty of this place. We have to also say that Bill Shockley was a great innovator, a fantastic talent spotter, but he was a terrible manager. So in other words, he was a bad entrepreneur, a great innovator. And he was the individual who was able to spot the few talents, the few experts nationwide in semiconductor, and actually he went even overseas to attract people, and he formed a very talented team. However, this team became very quickly disillusioned or discontent with the management style of him, and it led to the so-called traitorous aid to leave Shockley to form Fairchild Laboratory. However, it was this set of circumstances and the behavior of these unique two individuals which led to the formation of what we call Silicon Valley today. We couldn't go much farther in this discussion without bringing Mr. Arthur Robb. Mr. Arthur Robb is the individual who has introduced the modern concept of venture capital. Art was a young MBA, recently graduating from Harvard, who was working in the East Coast. And he was the individual being called by the Traitorous Eight to raise $1.5 million to form Fairchild Semiconductor. An effort that he nearly failed. It wouldn't have been at the last minute by the Fairchild family being willing to fund this activity. It was 11 years old later, in 1968, that a subset of the Traitorous Eight called again Art Rock, and he was able to fund and to raise the $5 million required to launch Intel in less than 30 minutes. And he said that in one of his interviews that it was one of the very few investments that he made that at the time that he considered a sure bet. Art was recognized, and this will use this as a measure of recognition by society of how many times an individual is shown or displayed in the cover of Time magazine. And Art was given that recognition in the late 80s. We also identified other recognitions in the cover of Time magazine. In 1983, instead of having the man or the woman of the year, is the machine of the year, the PC. And then later, Herb Boyer, the founder of Genentech, was also recognized because sort of identifying the Silicon Valley is not just about IP, but also about other innovation, other technologies, in this case, biotech. Also, we have seen George Lucas being recognized. In this case, his recognition is because computer animation in the creating of full feature films, and therefore he was also recognized. And finally, another of the many recognized has been Steve Jobs. In the case of Steve Jobs, 8 times he came out in the cover of Time magazine, giving him one of the individuals that got the most number of covers during his lifetime. Now, the ecosystem continue being similar to those that kept the early settlers, the gold rush entrepreneurs here, which was the beauty of the place, the combination of the bay and the Pacific Ocean and the mountains that really captured the people who moved here and the willingness to be part of this and stay here. At the same time, a number of them relocated here. This is the group that led by Robert Noyce. Initially, some of them were already in Fairchild, and later on, Bob was one of the co-founders and CEO of Intel, one of the companies that then spun off hundreds of other semiconductor companies in the formation of Silicon Valley. And at the same time, we have here the garage of HP, where Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Parker did their early innovation in the 30s as the way to creation, on the way of creation of HP. Which leads us to the 1980s with a picture of Silicon Valley. And this picture of Silicon Valley, you can see many of the brands of the time, some of them not any longer into existence, because they are constantly renewal of this ecosystem, an ecosystem that what you see is a true knowledge economy ecosystem with very high mobility of people and very high circulation of ideas. This ecosystem led what required a preparation, and the preparation was in many ways the transition of this ecosystem as the population growth by a factor of 4 between 1940 and 1960, the decay of an agricultural economy into an urban economy, clearly representing the trend of society at the time and attracting more and more white collars that were the young engineers, the young scientists, the young businessmen that actually start populating this part of the world. And of course, the culture of risk-taking continues. Not much different than the early gold rush entrepreneurs, but it continues throughout the semiconductor fever, not the gold fever, the gold rush fever of the 1840s, 1850s, but now here we are in the 60s and the 70s and define what we call unemployment to become entrepreneurs and all the risks that they were required. The reward certainly was economic. In those days it was measured by the size and the weight of the car, but it kept feeding the security of the family at that time, but also it was now the beginning of the hippie movement that add color and elements of the culture, of the rebel culture of what Silicon Valley still is today. The formation of the community was formed through the urban or the suburban setting, which was introduced by William Levitt, also recognized by Time magazine, which was sort of the father of the Levitt towns, which it was this cookie cutters type of housing in the suburbs, supported by the church, supported by the whole ecosystem in terms of shopping and entertainment and so forth, and also at that time the hippie movement is taking full swing of activity here in San Francisco. This continues the evolution throughout the 80s. And at that time, it was recognized the need to compute, to interconnect all the computing power in networks. And these networks were within buildings or within states or countries or around the world, leading to the World Wide Web. This is a very key movement because again, with the same culture before of democratizing and empowering individuals through their actions into corporations, empower now an entirely new activity of commerce, empower the democratization of information access, and all kinds of services and new companies being created that we all recognize. Which also led to more and more activities of increased value added that we identify in areas like mobility, of cloud computing, biotechnology, green technologies, alternative energy, and health. And all these areas are new areas of value creation because the valley has this ability to constantly renew itself, and in that effort of renewal, constantly seeking additional value added. So, not much different from the early days as the early settlers came here seeking economic rewards, forming community, getting prepared to tackle these activities and all the risks associated with this. We end up this value added and we bring it up to date with this new way of value creation, launching ourselves into all these new areas of entrepreneurial activity. So as we look at this digital revolution, we are going to go and look who are the risk takers of today's Silicon Valley. And we see here some of the key leaders, each one in their own industry, from Facebook and LinkedIn, and Kleiner Perkins, the premier venture capitalist firm, Marisa Mayer today at Yahoo, etc. All the names that we can recognize that they form the ecosystem which companies that probably 10, 15 years ago, most of them were not truly available. The preparation which is required today is not much different of the preparation of Eon in the Matrix, which really here is as a metaphor for those of you in the audience which have been born digital. So you have had access to a laptop or a desktop or some kind of mobility device, mobile device, almost since birth. But this born digital generation is in all likelihood also born global, because they're constantly able to shape their grand visions, not to serve their state or their country, but they go well beyond the boundaries of the country, and they are not afraid of failure. They're already risk takers which are willing to think out of the box and to suffer the consequence often that not always lead to success. But then after multiple failures, you have an extraordinary lessons that you can learn and leverage on them. The reward continue being economic, but there are some important considerations. It's not just in this knowledge-based economy that innovation and entrepreneurship is sufficient to create value, but now we have to think of global markets. And if you think of global markets, you're going to expose your innovation to imitators and competitors all over the world, so you have to move very quickly. If you are successful in executing this promise, then the creation of wealth can be extraordinary. If not, you can reflect for a second on Bill Gates, someone who in 25 years was able to become the wealthiest person in the planet because of the ability to envision the future of the office worker, the future of the worker in the home office, and capture those innovations into a set of products, in particular Windows, the ability to tackle global markets and execute that vision very, very quickly. At the same time, they will continue forming community. The community is the center in the various universities that populate here, Northern California, but also the activity of those universities and the interaction with industry, with government, with all the different stakeholders. And at the same time, there is a creation of legacy by reinvesting the wealth of many individuals that they have created through their companies into a number of non-profit or different type of institutions that continue helping to maintain a history of where we came from and leading the path of where we're going. And at the same time, there is a constant reinvestment for the activities that they continue priming the pump, continue fertilizing, energizing the innovator and entrepreneurial ecosystem of Northern California, the Bay Area, or also Silicon Valley. So the formation of this community is not much different of the formation of the community of the early entrepreneurs, the gold rush entrepreneur, and the constant theme among them is the DNA. It's the self-selection process that each one goes through in terms of the ability to take risks and the ability to pay the consequence of failure, but also capitalize those failures in terms of future success. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I invite you to read my blog, which is carlosvaradero.com, or to visit Sausalito Ventures, which is the company that I lead in terms of connecting young ventures from the emerging countries, in particular the Latin countries, in Latin America and Silicon Valley. Thank you very much for your attention. Until next time. Bye now.